This is Work in Progress, an art gallery of Greater Victoria podcast series. My name is Reagan Shrum, and I'm the curator of Listener in Residence. Work in Progress is a new podcast series that offers some insight from behind the scenes of the curatorial and educational projects and collaborations that could be seen more as open-ended or progress-based. These projects highlight some of the experimental and exploratory work that is taking shape both inside and outside of the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria's physical gallery spaces. The series is recorded and produced on the traditional and unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples and is generously supported by a Canada Council for the Arts Digital Now grant. In this episode, we are joined by two participants, Juliette and Joyce, from the AGGV's Listener in Residence series. This program was an intergenerational mentorship and skill sharing program connecting LGBTQ2+ youth with LGBTQ2+ seniors throughout British Columbia. The program was created in order to help ease isolation and encourage intergenerational relationships. Juliette, Joyce, thank you so much for joining me. Perhaps you would like to start us off by introducing yourselves.
My name's Juliette. I use she, they pronouns. I am 22 years old and I identify as a lesbian and also as non-binary. I'm a white settler here on Lekwungen territory. I'm originally from Anishinaabe Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory, and I've been here for 5 years now. I'm a student studying gender studies and environmental studies in my final term at UVic. I'm also a musician and a childcare provider, and I also like to get involved in some community organizing when I can. I'm currently doing work with community food support. I'm curious and passionate about many things that I was excited to bring to this program, including music, spirituality, community, intersectionality, food justice, and the many ways that I think all of those themes can connect with queer community and with each other in wonderful ways.
My name is Joyce. I'm a 70-year-old cisgendered female Caucasian. I go by she and her. I identify as a lesbian, and COVID gave me the gift of retirement, so I don't have any paid work these days, but I spent a long time as a facilitator, project manager, change consultant, mostly self-employed. And right now I'm doing volunteer work as the content developer in an LGBTQ2SI+ Generational Allies project that is interviews with seniors between 55 and 85 who to share about their experience really of harassment and discrimination and what kinds of experiences taught them resilience and how that helps as they age. Everything will be posted on the On My Planet website and available for download or free to view.
Well, thank you both. And you're both, of course, a part of the Listener in Residence program at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. And you were paired together. And I'm hoping you can discuss your experience of the program.
Because of the project that I was doing, I forget how I became aware of the Art Gallery project, but one of the things that had arisen in the research we were doing was this desire on the part of seniors to actually have more intergeneral relationships with queer youth. And that I realized that I myself felt exactly the same way. So I signed up for the program. Yeah, so when I was paired with Juliette, it was kind of, I put out my motives right up top. That really my motivation for signing up for the program was really to make a new friend. The learning and sharing that we did was kind of a byproduct. And one of the big benefits is that we live in the same area. So it was very easy for us to get together in person, outdoors during the pandemics. And that really helped. So, and the guidelines that the art gallery provided about weekly contact and suggested some things. And my background is in meditation and movement as my kind of non-work practice. And so those were the kinds of things that I had to offer. Because I like learning, I like doing new things. I don't mind taking risks. I don't really see myself as an artist. So that was really, kind of, well, let's just see how it goes. And for me, Juliet is a very easy person to talk to. And, we found some common ground fairly quickly. And I've certainly, I think more than anything else, just enjoyed getting to know her and being willing and able to spend as much time together as we could carve out in mutually busy lives. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of the things that Joyce just said. Actually, the first thing that came to mind with this question was the relationship building versus like creative aspect of the project. And I definitely went in to Listeners in Residence thinking that I would be mostly learning new skills and that would be the focus. And instead, something, I think, just realizing the ease with which Joyce and I were able to connect and form a quite close relationship quite quickly. It became much more apparent to me that I was putting down roots in community in a new way, rather than simply learning a new practical skill or creative skill. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of reflected in the ways that the two of us chose to explore our creative skills, because we had lots of different interests, and instead of focusing on one or two things, we painted, we did contemplative movement, we did some music, we did baking, we did some walks around in nature together, just kind of a breadth of experiences that we could share together. And I think that kind of, for me, at least, speaks to the ways in which it was really focused for us on just becoming friends and being creative in a way that lets us do that in a free way.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of touched on the trick I did for the project, in which I know, Joyce, you said that you don't consider yourself an artist. I come from the thought that everyone is an artist, and that life itself is just a practice, an artistic practice. But a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that thought of them being an artist, that putting that label on themselves. So, the actual art practice part of the project to me was that relationship, the friendships that grew between each pair, and the skill sharing, which was another aspect, that people would share skills with each others and learn from each other. That was kind of a way to bring people into the process where they felt a little bit more comfortable of oh yeah, I know how to cook and I could share that. But really that was just a ploy to get people to connect. And why do you think why is it important in your life to connect and create relationships? Particularly, I think, in intergenerational. And how do you think that could also help the wider community? It's big questions.
Well, I think, like in my life, first of all, I'm an introvert. And so COVID hasn't been that harsh for me in a lot
You could have told me, Joyce.
And so I prefer, to get to know fewer people more deeply. Mm. And while I have lots of friends in here, I've only lived here about 12 years. I don't have any family here. And so in some ways, kind of widening the breadth of my relationships to include more generations has helped widen my perspective, right? To be able to see the world from the view of someone who has completely different experience. Like, one of the things that we talked about was about queer history and our coming out experiences and things like that. And so, sitting from where I am, it's kind of like, yahoo, it wasn't so hard, right? But also, the world has changed enormously in the time that I've been on the planet. And it's very good for me I do try to expose myself to alternative views. Not that I agree with everything by a long shot, but just to be able to, like for me, learn about what Juliet's studying that didn't even exist as a field when I came through university. Right? Like, there are kind of occupations and professions that have just actually expanded the opportunities in ways that weren't even hardly conceived of. Even in my own field, it was not really a field when I first started in it, right? It became a field over the years that I worked in it. And so that's one thing, but I think the feeling of community, like for me, I operate in a number of communities, probably everyone does, but there's kind of the fact that we're kind of neighbors. So that's like a geographic community. So we share a neighborhood. We share the gender expression and at the same time, like I spent lots of years in university, but it's a very long time ago. And I'm a dabbler when it comes to learning. So I like to dabble in new things, but there's very few things that I actually pursue in any depth at this point. And, I introduced Juliet to those things. I think the thing that is the most, dare I use the word delicious, about developing a friendship is that that discovery process, that discovery of what connects us and what has taught us differently. And, we're just now at the place where we're starting to talk about things that are more personal, more intimate to our lives. Mm-hmm. And, like that, having those kinds of relationships is what helps community as a whole, because the more we have that kind of inner congruence and that outer kind of sense of being seen and heard with each other, I think that benefits the community hugely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the first thing that comes to mind about relationship building is just how important it is to build strong bonds, to me, and I think to like the broader queer community. I think that as LGBTQ people, we are inherently craving connection and expansive and moving through the world in ways that kind of, crave that intimacy and connection. And so connecting just on the basis of that is already, I think, connecting on a deeper level. And I would also just say, I think that politically, I feel like I've gone through a shift recently in really like wondering about my impact on like my community and the world and like what that can look like. Like, I think that as young people, or at least as a young person, like I was taught to make individual choices that could have an impact on the world, or like, do something small that will change the whole world, and that it'll all be wonderful when we change the world for the better. And I've definitely unpacked that and changed my perspective on that, but I haven't changed my understanding and value that like what I do matters. But I think now that what I do matters for very different reasons than what I previously thought, if that makes sense. And so I think relationships is actually a huge part of that, because, I'm moving towards this idea that like I can make decisions that are impactful, and they are impactful because they make me feel alive and held in place and like I'm part of a special community. And so suddenly creating strong connections take a really forefront role in my life when it's framed like that, and like when what I do matters is framed in that way. And I think, on the most basic level, that building connections is what we're meant to do as people. It's just a way of surviving and being in the world and having community. I think that's important.
And I think historically within the LGBTQ2 plus communities, there's been a disconnect between generations because, one reason is because the AIDS epidemic. Another reason is often folks are kind of like there's different generations who have different values or different thoughts of what comprises of the queer community, and that is not necessarily always accepted. Certain generations don't accept others who are within the queer community, but really, like, often queer folks, sometimes have disconnect from blood relations, especially in the coming out process. So that importance of connecting with community is like essentially your chosen family. And I wonder, how do you both have any ideas of how to create those connections between generations, be it either queer or non-queer?
For me, I think there's been a lot of learning over the last few years about what is our community. I spent several years as a lesbian separatist, so I can attest to the slicing of the rainbow. And I think one of the other impacts that we don't necessarily think about is assimilation. And one of the other ones is that, I think one aspect of that kind of generational divide is that people get very settled in their own little subs of the community. And unless they have a reason to break out of it, then it allows us to sort of sit in our lack of understanding. And, and quite honestly, sometimes that leads to immediate judgment rather than sort of saying, well, I wonder what's going on here. When I did the first trans project, I had to learn a lot. It wasn't that, I had any particular strong opinions about it, but I just didn't know. I didn't know, I had to learn the whole pronoun thing. I had to, feel comfortable with it, and I still trip. And also because of that project, which was a trans inclusion project for youth, I met all kinds of people who are like wonderful. And I think the freedom of expression that was not part of my generation. I have people I know in my life who have been institutionalized, jailed, beaten, all kinds of things, right? So the opening of the doors has in some ways, diluted the pond. But I think what happens is that we look for like. It's just a natural human thing. We look for like. And at the same time, I think for people of my generation, there is also this longing, because one of the things that came up in our interviews is that, like, when we were fighting for human rights legislation, for women's rights, for reproductive rights, whatever we were activists around, there was this sense of community, right? The lesbians were in there like a dirty shirt during the AIDS epidemic. I myself did buddying for more than one person with AIDS. And at the same time, because of that kind of sexism generally in our society, we were left out of a lot of queer history as if we were just a sidebar, right? And it is true, like, my affinity is for women. So most of my relationships are with women. Doesn't mean I don't like men, or I don't, like people that are different than I am, for God's sake. Like, how boring is that? But I think that just like other issues, in our society, it's our individual responsibility to sort of challenge ourselves to step out of that box of thinking and engage with people and say, tell me your story. Tell me about yourself. Tell me, I'm curious, why do you think that? Or what experience taught you that? Or, to be just more open. But within the queer community, particularly the older queer community, like, we're dying off, for one thing. And so, it's kind of wanting to have a sense of legacy is one thing, but also wanting to kind of learn and continue to grow, right? And one way to do that is to get to know people who are different. Now, the rainbow is like a panoply, so you got a lot to choose from, right? But I think to your question about how would we do that? Like, we've been talking about that in my project as well, right? I think in one thing that I have learned from this project is that the way there is through conversation, perhaps facilitated conversation, and people always it's easier to get to know someone if you're doing something together.
Yeah.
So whether that's creative or productive or gardening or whatever it is, what it is doesn't matter as long as the interest is mutual.
Yeah, I love that you said that last, Joyce, because that was my answer. Is when you sent me this question, the first thought that came to mind was to find a new hobby or broaden your interests or try something new. Because I think that, I will speak more on how, like, different systems of oppression are poisoning the queer community and have poisoned the queer community. But I also just think that simply a lack of outreach in communities is really stunting our abilities to connect with each other. I think it depends place to place, but specifically, living in Victoria for 5 years, I think that there are a lot of really wonderful, beautiful things about the LGBTQ plus community here. But one of my biggest issues being in community here is how difficult it is to, break the brick wall to get in and out and make those connections and move around. And I think age definitely has something to do with that. And I think ageism is a oppressive structure that isn't really talked about a lot, but that is, I think, huge in all communities, including LGBTQ plus communities, on both levels. And I think that for me, as someone who's in kind of a young adult, I have definitely seen around me and also internalized ageism, both for older and younger members of my community. And I just think that is a huge problem and needs to be changed. And I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I am able to connect in my life with both younger people. And now I have a wonderful friend, Joyce, that I can connect with, who's older than me. And it's really helped me realize that this myth that your friends have to be in the same place in life as you is just really BS. Like it's just not a real prerequisite for finding common ground and connecting. And I think we've been taught that you move through the world parallel to people and that is how you bond, when there's just so much to learn from breaking out of that, I think. So yeah, I think that is my kind of more theoretical answer. And then on the practical side, I think I've met people by trying things that scare me, or picking up a new hobby, or doing something together, as you said, Joyce. It's a really valuable way to connect, I think.
And I have two thoughts from what you just said, Juliet. Of first, the thought around a mentorship, which I think traditionally it's always the older person who is like supposed to be giving the wisdom to the younger person, as though, yes, Joyce is like shaking your head. But like that to me is also BS, that there's so much to share. A mentorship should be non-hierarchical. It should be an equal setting, that both people have things to learn from each other. And I think you both have demonstrated that so much, of like sharing opinions, sharing conversation, that there's just so much to learn from one another. And something else that you said, Julia, that made me think of in our last listener in residence like meeting, where monthly we would all meet over Zoom and kind of update, learn from each other, talk with each other. So it wasn't just our pairings. But one of the participants, who I think is our youngest participant, said that like over Zoom, having these monthly meetings was like the most amount of queer folks that they had ever experienced, which really was touching for me, because again, my assumption that younger folks than me are having queer experiences like earlier, like realizing that they are queer and also building that community earlier, but how that is not always the case too. Yeah, that just sparked to my mind.
I can touch on this mentor in the past. Like I had a business mentor and it didn't work, partially because we couldn't relate. Well, primarily because we couldn't relate to each other. The business models were totally different. The sector was different. And so it was a frustrating process for me, because I didn't feel like he felt unavailable as well, because he couldn't relate, right? So it was frustrating on both our parts. That's why I particularly like the way you set this up, right? It was funny for me when Juliet was talking about how she went to a reskilling class and learned how to make corn tortillas from scratch. I'm sort of thinking, here I am. I'm old enough. I was part of that whole generation where, there was this idea that there was enough skilled labor. And so we just stopped funding it, right? So now at this end of my life, where people my age and younger are retiring from those skilled programs, now there's this huge gap. I think the other thing too is that we tend to think in little blocks, right? There is this natural beginning, middle, and end that really, from a lifespan approach, we don't think like that. We think there's youth, and that has this certain age group. And then there's kind of this big block of your productive years. And then there's this gradual decline. But there are so many nuances. And nowadays too, even my generation, I didn't do the same thing my entire career. I know people who did, but I didn't. And so, there was, like this very linear model of life that is thin and flat and doesn't really kind of reflect in any reality the richness of lives that people live, whether that's, doesn't matter what the parameters are on it, right? It's kind of like this desire, we all have a desire for a full life. And so I think we do ourselves because we don't see that intergenerationally, and with particularly the decline of kind of having that extended family idea, kind of, a micro community that you can develop different relationships with and go to different people and talk to each other about how they got through this or that, or, that might be a mythical version of family these days, but there isn't that kind of built-in support anymore. So back to the question or the comment you made about the young person and having that queer surrounding, right? Luckily, I kind of fell into it. When I was coming up there, the bar was the place to go. But, I also came up thinking, well, everybody was just like me. Well, that wasn't true either. So it was kind of, how do we create possibilities for those of us at any stage of life, right? One of the fears that is there within my age group is ending up in a care situation where, they might have a policy at the institutional level, but your neighbor, doesn't have any background and has very strong judgments and opinions at our age and stage tend to come out unfiltered. People are complex, right? We live complex lives. So, our opportunities need to reflect that. And while the beauty of all of the online stuff that is available now is wonderful, at the same time, we're 3D human beings, and it's different to have an in-person conversation than it is to have one online.
Joyce, are you saying that the bare bones expectations of capitalism don't accurately reflect the nuances and richness of being alive? I'm shocked.
Actually, you're not. Why we're a good pair. I ramble and she makes it a succinct point.
Speaking of capitalism and what is expected of us, so this program, this listener in residence program, is not a traditional art gallery project. It isn't. A lot of projects that I curate, I get questions from individuals saying, "Why is this art?" This is an ongoing part of my curatorial process of always being questioned and always having many answers, but not everyone, of course, agrees. What do you think are the values of having kind of this more non-traditional? Because many people think of art galleries, they think we're going to paint landscapes, we're going to sculpt figures, and that's kind of in general, there's different perceptions of art, but I think that's a generic one that is shared by a lot of the public. So what kind of values do you think in having these kind of non-traditional art programs?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is this idea of process versus product, and how we've been taught, I think, by kind of the institution taking over our creative minds, that a final product is necessary and is the art piece, when I actually think that couldn't be farther from the truth. Like, I think that the creative process is what makes something creative. And so, kind of returning back to the beginning of our conversation about how, like, building a relationship became a creative process for Joyce and me, I think that speaks to the limits of seeing art as something that is on a page and is decontextualized and isn't in the world and isn't in community and isn't just an everyday part of being alive. And I guess the other thing that comes to mind is the archive and like this construct that we have of the archive and like what we get to save and what we think is worthy of documenting. I don't think that that is apolitical. And obviously, I mean, that's a much longer conversation that I think folks and a lot of queer folks are having within art gallery spaces because, historically art galleries haven't been affirming of subversive ways of creating. And, I think that is what art is all about. And so part of that is breaking up, how can the process become archive and like, how can a relationship become a piece of art, and I think those are questions that are worthy of being on the table, even if they sound silly. And they're also, I think, caught up in like returning to the experience of queerness and like what that can offer.
Yeah. I was reminded as you were speaking, Juliet, that, it's just like binary code, right? Like we see the world in black and white. It's ones or zeros. Well, we know that isn't true about gender. So why would it be true about anything else, right? And and in my meditation tradition, we view life as sacred and that art, like life, is part of everyday life, right? It's just part of, and that you can be artistic around your space. You can be artistic around your dress. There's nothing there. We think it's kind of like art, not art. Mm. And that, I think, that sort of binary approach to it is just not operational. Now, see, you got me on this bandwagon again. Now it's about classism, right? Because who goes to art galleries, right? Who owns art, right? Those kinds of things, So I think there's this, we create these little boxes that make me better than you, right? That all of it are reflections. We're looking for these reflections of, am I okay? Who am I, right? That when really every single being has expression, so that's part of the reason why I like mostly artistic endeavors that are transient, right? Or more improvisational, because it's really kind of who am I now? What am I expressing now? When I put something out there, how does somebody else who has a completely different life respond to that? How does it affect me when I hear how their response to it? It's a form of communication, very creative form of communication that we have the possibility to keep creating. So I think when we think about the values that expresses it's life affirming. It's kind of that value of diversity. If we come back to the topic of our, queer community, it's kind of like, there's kind of those levels that take us from acceptance, from, discrimination to acceptance, right? And it's along that spectrum. And my firm value is that diversity creates richness. If we have this idea that we're still learning in this world and now we need to learn how to save the world, and what does that mean about our behavior and what we choose to do? There's just so many things out there. If I think of all the books that I've read in my lifetime, that would be a significant number of books, but it would be a drop in the bucket compared to how many books actually exist, and that's only one form. So I'll get off my soapbox.
And I feel like you both beautifully expressed how much, like, the importance of bringing a queer theory or a queer lens into institutions, be it art galleries or be it other institutions, because, it's hard to express outside of a queer community. But like that, Joyce, you touched on like the transient nature, which I feel like is often a queer experience of transient in identity, transient in sometimes community, and even the archives, Juliet, that you were talking about, of like just as we did like a taxonomy system within plants to like kind of colonialize these like colonized nature itself, we have kind of done through archives in museums of like needing to have exact numbers with everything and often collecting what was thought to be as important, which isn't necessarily a representation of what there is in this world of art. And I think you've already maybe both touched on this, but I'll see if there's any other answers. But what kind of changes would you want to see within art galleries?
I mean, I really appreciate you bringing up the colonial nature of hierarchies, because that was the first thing that came to mind as well when I saw this question, was just the need for a real critical inquiry into decolonization, not in like necessarily just a reconciliatory nature, but also like a critical inquiry into like how our knowledge systems are reflective of like worldviews that are harmful to anything that isn't like Enlightenment discourse and like the normification of everything, like hierarchy, I think is an example of that I think is something that isn't necessarily always like critically unpacked as like a colonial construct, but that I think is, and like even an idea of like mastery and skill comes to mind as well as something that needs, I think, a lot of unpacking like within art galleries and in a greater society. And I think just like on a personal level, like I am someone who has experienced kind of imposter syndrome about my like place in the world as an artistic and creative person. And Listeners in Residence kind of gave me the opportunity to really work on my confidence, I think, as like someone who has something to offer and like can bring something to the table in community. And I think that came from Reagan, you and Kara offering, like intentionally not making it a hierarchical space and also intentionally leaving it so open-ended that I felt like the things that I was bringing to the table were valuable and I didn't have to question or compare. And that was huge for me because I think that we're brought up to constantly be questioning ourselves and comparing what we create to other people's work. And I think that has no place in queer community and has no place in life, like, so yeah, I guess that was both an expansive and specific response that came up for me.
Yeah, I think the idea that we have to earn our right to be here, I think that's the idea that really needs to be challenged because we all do. We all have that inherent right. Our experiences shape us and so they shape our perspective. And the wonderful thing about having neuroplasticity and minds that can learn is that we can change our expectations and change our experiences and change our choices about how we participate in the world and how we develop. I know one of the things that I have seen some organizations do is kind of really focus on setting up these intergenerational conversations. And it just reminded me that you got so many youth who applied for Listeners in Residence. I think that because of the isolation, not just because of the pandemic or because we're queer and we can't have a hard time finding each other but I just think that really, the developed world is kind of well practiced in generating isolation from each other. And, this idea of always comparing ourselves, like that's so counterproductive. And, with an idea of learning, but doing it with a loving lens. Like most of it, I don't know about you, but I have a giant inner critic. And, and I think that's a cultural thing. And so when people who are not gender normative have really experienced that kind of isolation in a particular way because somehow who we are is just not okay. And, while that might be changing, I still think we have a long way to go. I mean, yes, maybe in Canada we have lots of freedoms, but, that's not true around the world. And I myself would welcome more conversation with people who are different than I am, whether it's race, culture, belief system, how they view family, how they view community, how they do living and dying. I don't, really there's so many topics that we could learn from each other. And also, there are buried within us, lots of skills that the heteronormative kind of majority kind of sees as lost when I think really they're just kind of buried a bit somewhere. Yeah, I think there's lots of possibilities for how art galleries can really engage community differently, even to kind of look at things that they do have within their collections and sort of say, how did this get to be here?
Joyce, you made me think of this book. It's called The Queer Art to Failure, which is a very good book. It's all about how it's in queer culture's nature to fail and how great that failure is, because it's like success is actually a heteronormative thing that queer folks are trying to get to, but really no, you need to create your own success by failing the heteronormative system. And I feel like you both spoke to that of art galleries, of instead of going with what has been tradition and that thought of success, maybe finding a new way, creating new systems. That was the end of our beautiful conversation. Does anyone have any final thoughts?
Just wanted to express my gratitude for the opportunity to explore these questions for this period of time. I think it's just added more than I could hope for to my life. And I guess that speaks to the care with which you, Reagan, went about facilitating. So thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'm not a big fan of too much structure. So I really appreciated the openness of sort of the suggestions around the curriculum, that we could find our own way. There was just enough kind of frame to make it clear and at the same time leave lots of possibility for discovery, and also to the art gallery itself for really continuing to apply for innovative projects that help, in that process of change. The change process that I have used in the last kind of 15 years is called Theory U. And one of the stages of it is prototyping. And Otto Schermer, who's the designer of this process, says, fail early, fail often. So, it's kind of how we learn and how we figure out what works, because particularly in Western cultures, we spend so much time planning and organizing and directing and doing all of these things that actually almost that for the most part prevent a creative outcome, whatever that is. Whether that's an increase, an enhancement in the sense of belonging in an organization, right? Which is probably pretty fundamental to most of us. And thank you, Reagan, having us share this with you. And thank you for conceptualizing the program. And thank you, Juliette. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Juliette, Joyce, thank you so much for joining me. For those who would like to learn more about my personal curatorial projects, you can head over to my website, reaganschrum.com. And for more info about the AGGV's Listener in Residency program, please visit aggv.ca.